So before we begin, on behalf of the Foundation and everyone gathered online, I'd like to acknowledge First Nations people as the traditional owners and custodians of the waterways and land on which we live and work, and pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm on Wurundjeri land today, but extend that respect to all First Nations people. Today, it's my pleasure to welcome Dr. Jane Oakes, who will be presenting her research on the phenomenon of relapse in electronic gaming machine gambling. Jane will be a familiar face to many of you, given her earlier roles in gambling leadership, treatment, engagement, help seeking and research. She's held roles including the Gambling Services Coordinator at Turning Point's National Phone and Online Services, a clinical consultant role at the Alfred's Gambling Minds Program, and clinical leadership roles at the South Australian Intensive Gambling Help Service and the statewide Gambling Therapy Service in South Australia. Jane's academic positions include Gambling Topic Coordinator within the Master of Addictive Behaviours at Monash and Flinders Universities. In 2014, Jane completed a PhD that examined relapse in electronic gaming machine gambling. Findings from this study have informed clinical practice, government and public health initiatives. She's published articles and book chapters and given invited presentations and workshops on gambling-related issues nationally and internationally. As an experienced researcher and practitioner, Jane is well placed to share her insights into the process of relapse from many subjective perspectives, highlighting the different risk factors involved. And just before I hand over to Jane, a couple of housekeeping issues. If you have any questions, please type them into the chat. I'll be facilitating the Q&A session at the end of the presentation and we'll get to them then. And also, as you may have seen, we'll be recording today's session. And with that, I'll hand you over to Jane.
Thank you very much, Luke, for that introduction. So what I'm going to talk to you today about is my research. And prior to starting my PhD, I've worked with people experiencing gambling harms for many, many years. And what started me to look at the actual relapse process was that I was really interested in finding out why people continue to relapse despite the harms they discussed when I would talk with them during the assessment period. So that's why I decided to start my PhD looking at relapse in electronic gaming machine gambling. So what I'm going to share with you today is a little bit about my study and some of the findings that I've found out and fine-tuned throughout my career talking with people experiencing gambling harms. So firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people as the traditional owners and custodians of the waterways and the land on which we live and work, and pay respect to the elders past, present and emerging. Also, I'd just like to take a moment to talk about language, because as you are aware, gambling-related harm is a highly stigmatised issue. Society often blames individuals for the harms they experience, which can lead to embarrassment, shame and guilt. Like the Foundation, one of my priorities is to destigmatise gambling harm. Please keep this in mind and show your support through the language you use during this presentation. Thank you. So I just wanted to start by putting up this little slide about Carolyn Hirsch, who was a psychologist and also a member of Parliament in Victoria. And there was an article about her, and what was really interesting is that what I wanted to know was what led her to relapse or continued gambling, because Carolyn Hirsch was uniquely qualified to warn of the dangers of poker machines when she spoke at the Tasmanian Parliamentary Inquiry into future gaming markets. But that knowledge didn't help Miss Hirsch when she became addicted to the machines herself. And what she said in this article was, "I have nothing to leave my children. It all went." So we can see that the harm is significant for people, and yet they continue to gamble. So I hope today that you'll have some understanding from the perspectives of people experiencing gambling harm, why it is they continue to gamble. So my presentation will take a look at the literature, particularly at the time which started my study, the methodology of my study, some results, some implications, and some limitations. So what did the literature say at the time I decided to start my research was that the literature is extremely limited and in its infancy with regards to relapse. A lot of methodological problems led to interpretation issues. The biggest gap was that there was no clear description of relapse, and the current descriptions were incomplete and they were simplistic. Some of the key papers showed that a more recent study with 270 people at 12-month follow-up from treatment showed that 41% were abstinent. However, 29% were still meeting the criteria for gambling disorder, and another 29% continued to gamble without meeting the criteria for gambling disorder. So what we can see is that quite a few people continued to gamble after the treatment program finished, and urge and cognition seem to be one of the reasons why people continue to relapse, and relapse rates are high even with the best treatment, and few empirical studies have evaluated relapse, and most focused on single factors in isolation. So I really wanted to understand the continuum of what was going on with relapse. So my study was a grounded, very qualitative study, because I really wanted to hear from people at the ground, their experiences of what was going on. And so the first part of my study was focus groups. And so I had 35 people, and I interviewed therapists that provided behaviour therapy. I interviewed people that had been through treatment and their significant others. I interviewed counsellors. I went to New South Wales and interviewed some cognitive psychologists, and also some people who were attending Pokies Anonymous. And then those findings I took to in-depth interviews to really try and understand in more detail from the in-depth interviews. And I interviewed treatment seekers, people who are attending Pokies Anonymous, and non-treatment seekers. That seemed to give me a really good understanding of what was going on. And after my study finished in 2014, I've continued to ask and try and understand what's going on. So throughout my whole research process, an external auditor continued to validate the fidelity and analytical process of my study. So what I'm going to talk with you today is about the factors that contribute to relapse. I'm going to talk about some facilitatory cognitions, or thoughts that were particularly evident in the people I spoke with. I'm going to talk about the zone, the push and pull of relapse, and why gamblers don't learn. So that will be what happens during relapse and how we can help prevent relapse. So firstly, with regards to facilitatory cognitions, you would all have heard these kind of thoughts that people discuss, but I really brought them together to understand what was going on. And what I found was that that these kind of thought processes led to erroneous logic in people's thinking patterns, and these included permission giving, where the gambler gives themselves permission to use money that's not available or affordable to relapse. They use thoughts that deny the reality of the situation if they gamble. They seem to forget the harms once they start thinking about allowing themselves to gamble. They've forgotten the family at home, the debts that they gambled last to pay, and all the money was gone, and the excuses for gambling losses, so they continue to gamble. And these kind of thoughts impacted the gambler's ability to show critical thought, self-reflection, which inhibits learning, and underestimate the capacity for moral judgment. So other kind of thoughts were an underestimation to pay debts, overestimating the capacity to pay bills if they gamble the money, underestimating impacts on significant others, lying to themselves, and of errors in memory. And so we can see when the gambler has these kind of thoughts and they believe them, it's very difficult to stop gambling at that time. And so I'm just going to give a couple of quotes to you just to help you understand some of the examples I was seeing, but all the names and pictures are all de-identified. So one person who I spoke with was John, and he was a treatment seeker, and he was 44-year-old at the time, and he had 2 children, and he'd lost over $80,000 to gambling, and he had had counselling for about 12 months when I saw him, and yet he continued to relapse. And so what was interesting that he was Catholic, and he had a lot of despair related to his religion and gambling, and he had this fear that he would go to hell because of his gambling was against his religion, and that was not enough to stop him. He had depression, guilt, financial problems, marital problems, work problems, but he continued to go. However, at the end of the treatment course that I had with him, and at 2 years follow-up, he was no longer gambling. But some of the quotes that he said were that there was some zoning there because your mind tends to justify it. And that's the time to call, because you're not out of control. You've still got some control because you're not in there yet. So what he was referring to is that before he was really committed to gamble, before he'd really lost the capacity to make rational thought, if you called him, his wife could perhaps say, come on, don't gamble. However, then he said, once his urge and excitement rose and he entered that zone level, he said it was unstoppable. That's when you're in and it's got you, and you've got to the ATM, you've got your money, and you can forget about the phone calls, because at that stage, he said he's gone too far and nothing would stop him from gambling at that time. And then we can see Janet. Now, she was one of the most sad elderly ladies I think I've seen, and I still think she was one at this time in my career many years later. She was a 72-year-old widow, and she'd spent 2 years at the time gambling on the pokies. And when I spoke with her, she talked about the grief that she was experiencing after losing her husband, and she just did not want to go home to that lonely house. And for her, gambling provided a relief from her unresolved grief, depression, the financial problems, health problems, family problems, where they couldn't understand why she continued to gamble. But she described that she was in a cocoon when she gambled. And that's what I find, and that's what I like the feeling of, because in the cocoon, I'm away from everybody, away from life. She didn't want to be here anymore. I don't want to be. I wanted to die. And I think that the main thing that drove me to insane levels was the fact that she just could not experience the grief. It was too painful. And so gambling for her gave that relief from the despair she was feeling. And so here are some other examples from the people I interviewed that talked about the zone. For example, glued to the machine in a bubble, fixated, robotic, hypnotized in a trance-like state, blank, in another world, delirious. But all those descriptions of the zone was clear that there was no objective logic and loss of volition, and all participants in the in-depth interviews described this experience. So what I'd like to share with you also is, and I've published papers about, these were my early papers about the push and pull of relapse, and more recently I published a paper called The Merry-Go-Round. And what's clear is this cycle of gambling is difficult to break. And here's some examples from someone who was a Pokies Anonymous member. She said, I just felt sick. I felt the lowest of low you could feel, a bit disgusted in myself. So you can see that these people experience a lot of shame. Yes, just felt horrible, very unhappy, very depressed, because I just didn't know virtually where my next meal was coming from. So Monica continued to gamble, and at the end of her session, reality seemed to hit her, and she thought, what am I going to do? And Greta was saying, I was putting us further and further in debt, and it made me feel absolutely sick. In fact, I did try to commit suicide twice, and yet despite trying to take her life, a week after the last time that I tried to commit suicide, I was back at the hotel again, and this is this kind of merry-go-round where people just don't seem to be able to get off. So what I wanted to know was, why don't gamblers learn from the experience? What's going on? Does the zone affect the ability to learn? So that's what I found when I was speaking to my clients and my participants, was that the zone really need to be considered. So I looked at the literature, and at the time I found that there was quite a lot of reference to the zone, where people called it an altered state of awareness, dissociative, a trance-like state, narrowing of attention, people removed from reality, distraction from life problems, escape from trauma, or an unthinking mode, distorting perceptions of time and money, and the capacity to zone out and dissociate from worries, as we can see with that lady who was wanting to be in a cocoon. So what I might do now is just share with you something that I found from talking to the participants, and since talking to the participants ongoing in my career, I've continued to try and understand this. So I'm just going to put up the whiteboard now. So this is a model that I draw for my clients as well, and it seems to give them some understanding, and it seems to make sense, because when I draw it for them, they understand that that's what's going on. So I'm going to draw it for you now, and I'm sorry that I'm not a great drawer, but I'm going to do my best. So this is the model that I pulled together from all my findings, or one of the models. So that's urge at the top, and that's 8 out of 8. And then we have 0 at the bottom, where there's no urge. And sort of about halfway is there, that's about 4. And so what I found when I was speaking to my participants and clients is they said that they were triggered, and this will all make sense. I'm sure that you've heard this many times from people, but I've pulled it together to really understand and help clients understand what's going on. So firstly, when someone is triggered, they have rational thought. They have rational thoughts where they might say to themselves, please don't go, I can't afford it, I lost last time, I need to pay my bills. But then they have this permission giving, or facilitatory cognitions that I talked about, where the gambler says, I'll just take $20, I can afford that, I won't pay all my bills, I'm sure that I'll win some money. And so what we have starting then is we have this vacillation that starts to happen between don't go, do go, and it really causes a lot of distress for the gambler as they try and work out in their mind what to do. But as the person starts to give themselves permission, the urge starts to rise. And when the urge sort of gets about halfway, what the participants said was that rational thought was gone. And then at that time, the gambler gives themselves permission to gamble. And so this kind of vacillation, this turmoil goes, and there's some peace where the gambler then thinks about winning. And like we know from that case that I said with the man who was talking about the zone, is that if you're going to help someone, what he said, it's where there's some rational thought, because once someone's got money and they're sure they're going to win, then rational thought's gone. And then what seems to happen is the urge rises. And this is where all the participants talked about, was that there was this place they enter called the zone. And when the gambler is in the zone, the only thing that they seem to want to think about is winning money. And for a lot of people, money means they can stay longer in the zone. But unfortunately, what happens, or what seems to happen in the zone, is that there's no memory. People forget the harm. They can't self-observe. They can't learn because they're just focused on winning. And they can't have the will to be able to stop gambling until the last dollar is spent, whether they're really rich or just have low socioeconomic. They gamble and gamble until the last dollar is spent. And when the last dollar is spent, the urge drops down. It's at that moment that rational thought comes back. But unfortunately, at that time, what my participants said was they entered this black hole of despair where the reality hit them, what they'd done. And that over time has become intolerable. And so what they've learned to do is they've learned to put a lid over that despair and plan the next relapse, because if they don't, then the options are very bleak, where suicide comes in and negative emotions. And so what we can see is the gamblers learned to not experience the negative emotions, not to self-observe, because from that moment, they go back in the trance-like state, waiting for the next payday or to pawn or sell something and try and win that money back. And so this is this vicious cycle that started for the gambler, where they've learned to escape negative emotions. And that's why when we're helping people, what we need to do is help them slowly to feel these emotions, because if we make them feel too much despair all at once, they'll go off and start to think about trying to win that money back. So now I'll keep going with my presentation. So I've just gone through that on the whiteboard, so I'll just quickly show you now, if that's all right, just to go through this in a model, which is what we've seen, is that we've got that vacillation, we've got the rise of the urge, we've got the person entering the zone where there's no memory, no ability to exercise the will to stop or self-observe. And then we can see that the person enters the despair. But what we know is if we can give these people, these gamblers, support to be able to experience the despair slowly, is that they can start to deal with that and self-observe and learn. And so just to recap, is that what we found is that repeated relapse is very hard to break. It's difficult to get off. And after relapse is a temporary break in the zone where critical thinking is often momentary, as the gambler is faced with consequences and negative affective states, the next relapse is planned. And interestingly, more recently, as I've been talking to people going through treatment, and once they seem to be able to recover, what happens is there's another part of what we need to consider. This was a school teacher, and I followed him up quite a few years after he finished treatment. And he said, there is not a day goes by that I don't think about the money I have lost. And what I've realised is that we need to consider regret. And as people are getting better and as we're treating them, is we need to really help them work through a different lifestyle. For example, some people say to me, Jane, I should have had that car, I should have taken my family on holidays, I should have my retirement fund ready for retirement, but it's all too late. Or a male that I've been treating in a country town, he sees his car drive by that he pawned. So when people stop gambling and critical thought comes back, is they are faced with the consequences, and we actually do need to help them to process that and move forward. And so what we need to take into consideration is that these people or gamblers are at risk, particularly when they find out how much their financial problems are once they stop gambling. So we need to make sure that we do risk assessment for people presenting for help. And here's another quote from one of my participants who talks about bank statements. And I really want to stress that we do need to be really careful when we present a gambler with their bank statement, because from my experience, it's not something that people want to see, is how much they've gambled, and it has to be done slowly and sensitively. So therefore, our implications are, don't reinforce negative emotions, because this can undermine learning as the person tends to zone out. And so we don't focus on gambling losses. And as I've said, Natasha Schull did a lot of work, and she said that a bank statement is a chronological index of withdrawals from the to gamble. So that just reinforces to be aware of bank statements and showing people too soon how much they've lost. So what we also need to be aware of is when we talk to people is what kind of thoughts are they telling themselves about how they can afford to gamble. We need to look at the urge to gamble, and also education for support for significant others about what's going on, why it is that people who have a gambling harm cannot stop. And one other important point that I found out throughout my career is that when people come for help, it's really important that we, on the first time they come, because we might only have one time, and when someone seeks help, is not to bombard them with assessment questions about the impacts of gambling harm, because if we do, they might not come back. So we need to do a graded exposure to harms, because this might be what's due to relapse when people drop out of treatment, and we need to teach gamblers to cope with negative emotions. So less emotion is elicited so people can engage in treatment. This is a model that I developed with my colleagues when I was at the National Helpline, because as I've just mentioned, it's very hard when people seek help. We might only have that one opportunity to be able to engage them in help seeking, that light bulb moment. And we realise, my colleagues and I, that what we need to do when someone seeks help is we really need to make the most of that help seeking opportunity. And so when someone seeks help, it's usually in a crisis. So if they ring up or they come to see us, it's important that we don't ask a confessional about what's been going on, because if we do, that could increase their distress. They could cause them to self-harm or to continue gambling, because as they've learned that gambling is the way to manage these increased emotions. On the other hand, what we've learned is that people have facilitatory, these cognitions where they want to keep gambling. And if we say to them, it's okay, we'll sort it out, don't worry, everything will be fine. If we reduce the distress too much, then we've got the permission-giving thoughts where the gambler might think, oh, it's not so bad, I can sort it out, I can keep gambling. So what we do want to do, though, is we want to give the gambler a level of distress where they can see this is a problem. So when someone reaches out, what we need to do is firstly acknowledge the courage it took. Well done for reaching out. It took a lot of courage. And then we want to normalise. It's normal to feel distress when you've been through what you've been through. And then just to ask, what was it at that moment that led them to seek help, that teachable moment? And then we want to give them hope that what we know is that with treatment, with support, people can get better. And if we can do that, we're hoping that people can continue the help-seeking journey. And so, however, what I've talked with you today is about my qualitative work, but that is a limitation of this model. It does need to be tested. And many people could not recollect in detail what happened, particularly during the zone, when they were in that zone-like state. There was a lack of impulsive young males or those who had spontaneously recovered. And also the zone needs further exploration. And so I would like to thank the VRGF, who funded a lot of the relapse study that I was involved in, my participants, Professor Victoria Manning, Simone Rudder and Dan Lubman, who were involved in the study that I did with the engagement model, and Sarah Hare, who helped me prepare my slides with me, and my supervisors, Renee Poles, Maria Stella Peraventi, and Associate Professor Sharon Law, Professor Sharon Law. Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much, Jane. That was a really fantastic presentation. Yeah, just really fascinating stuff. We've got, there's just one question so far. So if anyone has anything they'd like to know, just fire away. I'll just go from there's now two now, I'll go from the top. So regarding the comment about clients facing their losses and the emotion it may bring up, any comments about the timing of that when a client may also be seeing a financial counsellor concurrently and facing up to a lot of painful truths?
Absolutely, that's a really important question, is that it is very hard for the gambler to come in and talk about their financial harms, and that's something that hopefully that financial counsellors are aware of, is to do that slowly and to be sure that the person seeking help is in a position that they're able to deal with those losses, and that might have to be done slowly and making sure people have got support.
Yep. I guess there's a follow-up to that too. It seems one of the advantages of cashless gaming, account-based gaming, is that you can give people accurate records, complete records of their spending. But I guess that might be in some sense in conflict with what you've said today. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Absolutely. I think from my experience in talking with people who have experienced gambling harm, they really don't want to know at that moment when they're seeking help how much they've lost. And that also fits in with the regret that people experience once they're better, is they have to realise how much they've lost. And that really needs to be handled sensitively, because even an example for myself is that if I go shopping, I feel really nervous to look at my bank account sometimes, because because I don't want to see how much I've spent shopping, let alone how much I've lost gambling. So I think we just have to be really sensitive to people's, to gamblers that don't really want to be confronted with that when they're seeking help.
Yep. Okay, so the next question is, in your experience, what are the signs of relapse and how can we prevent it?
Relapse is, there's a lot of shame and a lot of stigma, and I talk to my clients a lot before I start treatment, and I think that model is really helpful. So it sort of helps people understand why they can't stop gambling, and it helps them understand the need for support, particularly with negative emotions, and if they do lapse or relapse, that it's okay to come back and talk with us, and it's part of the process. Is that treatment or relapse is not linear. There's ups and downs, and relapse when I work with my clients is the ability to stop and see, well, what happened, how can we move forward, is to learn from that and to develop skills and psychoeducation so people have the tools, particularly when they stop gambling, that they're able to deal with those emotions, or a life where they have to deal with negative emotions, life in general, which they've been avoiding for so long.
Yep. So the next question is, for those 40% abstinent, do you see any specific successful strategies to prevent relapse?
One of the very important strategies is keeping assets safe. If people can't access their money or their online accounts, that's the very first point that I talk with my clients, is to stabilise the gambling, is to have support. But then, of course, as you're all aware, that there is domestic violence is very high amongst people experiencing gambling harm. So we really need to be sure that whoever is helping somebody manage their money comes to a session where we can talk with them if we can, about how to manage that safely together and have boundaries. And if they don't feel that can be done safely, then we need to. And that's always difficult for some people that don't have supporters. Where else can they go? So they don't access their money. They don't have access, because that's the main predictor that people have. And of course, helping people deal with negative emotions, dealing with difficult situations, giving them skills to deal with assertion skills, new skills that they can learn. But certainly dealing with negative emotions, teaching people that the urge will pass. And if they haven't got access to money, that's a lot easier for them to be able to sit with that urge.
Mm. I guess there's another follow-up related to harm minimisation measures. How would you see the role of something like pre-commitment if it's a mandatory kind of system? Do you think that has a role to play or not?
Oh, sorry, could you repeat that? I just saw a question come up on.
Yeah. So just about the harm minimisation aspects of it, there's a lot of talk about, and related to cashless gaming, you have mandatory pre-commitment technology. Do you have any thoughts on how effective that might be in your experience?
I think that this is my experience, and this is talking to people that have had gambling harm, is that what we know is that when the urge is low and they've got support and they're in a good place, they can decide, yes, oh, I won't gamble more than this amount. But if they make the pre-commitment and they're chasing and they start to enter that zone-like experiences, any kind of strategy has to be really foolproof to make sure that the pre-commitment actually can be adhered to. Otherwise, there will be ways that people will try and keep chasing their losses, because it's really people are desperate to get back the money they've lost at that time.
Yep. Okay, thank you. And then the next one, maybe this one that you can follow up privately. Our team would be interested in a PD exploring this relapse issue. Is there anything available? So I'm not sure what PD stands for in this context.
Professional development. Maybe Tony and I have been doing some PD work in Victoria. So certainly if whoever asked that question, if they spoke with your team and Tony, then I'm sure we could arrange to do some more with you, and we'll be very happy to talk to you all about this issue in more detail.
Yep, excellent. Okay, so next is, in your view, what do we need to know more about relapse in order to better support people?
I think it's to be aware that, firstly, about money and loss of rational thought, dealing with people's despair, particularly I find that the more that I learn and I talk with my clients, is I really find it really beneficial to be able to teach them strategies before we start treatment as to how to deal with negative emotions, breathing exercises, grounding exercises. They're really, really important to stabilize people so that they can start to deal with letting the urges pass, not giving in to those high urges and those irrational thoughts that lead them to often gamble more than they can afford. So I really have found that grounding is a really important part of preparing someone for treatment.
Okay, excellent. We've got another one from Gabby here. So thank you so much, Jane. As you know, my PhD was on relapse prevention. So would you agree that we do need to put more effort into addressing relapse risk factors like leisure substitution and social isolation?
Absolutely, and that's what I find particularly with clients once they're better, is you really have to, and I think scheduling is another really important. These simple techniques are making such difference in people's lives, and it's not to sort of like put a lid on the gambling, it's when you take away gambling, what have people got? So we need to build a schedule into their life where they're learning to have time out, they're learning to deal with being bored, being lonely, having social connection. I think that social connection is really important, and connecting with society, and people need help to do that because they've lost the confidence more often. as they come out of gambling.
Yeah, there's that saying, isn't there, that addiction is the opposite of connection or something like that. So
Yes, that's right.
yeah. Okay, so the next one is, did you hear much from your participants about how environmental factors such as inducements and loyalty programs from venues impacted relapse?
Absolutely. They're huge impactors, and my participants, or even now my clients, sort of call them fishing hooks. They're out there trying to hook people back in. So we have to help equip clients to be able to deal with those hooks, and so they feel stronger and able to let the urges pass, and so rational thought can come back and they can realise, what these environmental factors are and what they're doing to the. I think one of the important points that I talk to my clients about is the reward pathway and lack of critical thought, and how we can break that pathway that's been developed over time through gambling, where the reward pathway becomes very present and takes over rational thoughts. So I think psychoeducation is really important, so people can understand what's going on to their brain and how they can actually retrain the way that they respond to triggers, so that they can be. Some of my clients say that they're vaccinated from those environmental triggers once they get through treatment, and they're free from that overwhelming urge and the thoughts that lead to relapse.
So there's one from Lindsay which does touch a bit on your answer to Garby's question, but just in case there's anything extra to add, is there a need for people to be offered or suggested alternative activities to undertake instead of gambling?
Absolutely. And I guess one doesn't fit all. Is we need to sit down with our clients, and that's why scheduling is really important. What's their individual preference? What do they like? And what I've done in with PsychMed, or the gambling program in South Australia, and I think it's really been helpful, is to have a treatment support group. And what I'm finding is people like to come along, particularly those that are lonely in country areas, and it's not so much gambling, it's teaching them skills, and they come back to the group and they talk about how they've applied the skills, and they mentor other people to use these skills. So it's people that have been through treatment or are going through treatment, to have that connection and to talk to people about what they're doing and what they can do. And I find that's a really positive place, and it's on Zoom, so people can come from all over South Australia, and they pop in when they want to. It's not compulsory, and it's a really helpful environment to support people through their recovery.
That's awesome. So we've got one from Tanya here. What learnings are there for venue staff who may be first responders, re people experiencing relapse, and have an opportunity to identify and prevent it?
That's a really important question. Thank you. I always go back to that model where people, it's a really vicious cycle, isn't it? When people are in venues, is that they're either really have a really strong urge to get in there and get their money into the machine, and so it's very hard to stop them during that time. And having the skill to be able to deal with someone when they've lost the money in that moment, where rational thought comes back, does take skill. But I think it's something that we can teach people, is at the right moment, if we can perhaps tap into people, because they're determined when they go to the hotel, from my experience, that they want to gamble, and like we can see, their urge is rising, no one will stop them, and they've got the money and they think they're going to win. No one could stop them. So it's more at the end of the cycle that perhaps we could help people, or else be aware that people going into the venue when they've got that high urge can't have critical thought, and how can we help them to gain some kind of thought about what's going on before the money's lost, is give them a moment where they can stop and think somehow. So that, then there's certainly some strategies we could talk about, or help venue staff to work out how best to respond, because these people, gamblers who've lost money, are very much in despair. So it's not easy to approach a gambler at the start or at the end of the session.
Mm. Yeah, especially if you're an 18-year-old and it's midnight on a Friday night and people are drunk, and you're busy doing other things. It must be, extremely difficult. So do you have any suggestions on the process of self-exclusion so as to minimize the shame or stigma or negative emotion?
No, I think I've thought a lot about this, and I don't know if this answers the question or not, but I think it's the language, it's what we're saying out there, and of course we know that gambling causes a lot of harm, but we also need to give the message that people can get better, and if you change the message, perhaps, like self-exclusion, and people can get better, you can get over this and send more positive messages rather than, you've got a problem, it's bad, you have to self-exclude. And I think we really need to try and say this is a really positive thing you can do, that people do, and they do get better, and it's a language and to help people understand what's going on rather than just think I'm bad, like some of those quotes that I gave you when someone keeps relapsing. It's, I felt disgusted, I felt bad. So people, when they're losing money, they do feel bad, let alone the messages that are out there. So I hope that helps a little bit.
Yeah. Got a related question from Brett here. So I'd also be interested if participants were interested in or took up exclusion options in addition to pre-commitment as a means of supporting relapse prevention.
Exclusion as well, and give them time, but it's also giving them the skills. We can say, don't go, let's stop you going, and that's a good break. But we found that with COVID is that people had the break, they saved their money, they bought nice things, and then the moment the hotels were open, rational thought was gone and money was gone.
Mm.
So psychoeducation, giving people tools, is really, really important as well.
Yeah. Yep. It was fascinating when you spoke about the psychologist and parliamentarian, was it, that had the, like, you think if someone like them is unable to resist it, it just shows how powerful that is. So thanks, Jane. Like the concept of zone and how difficult it is to come out from the zone area. Are there any handy strategies which we can give to our clients?
It's education. It's showing them that model. It's talking to them about the kind of thought process that they're having to themselves. As the urge rises, it seems to lead into this heightened state of arousal where people enter the zone. So it's really talking to people about the process and what's going on and the theory behind it. And if you can let the urge pass, each time it passes, it loses its power and rational thought can come back.
Mm. How long do the urges tend to last? I guess it would vary from person to person.
And that's a really good question, and that's why over time what I found is it's so important that when a gambler comes for help and we start to treat them, what we do is we teach them grounding techniques. They don't have money, and it's amazing if people can just learn to manage that urge, that distress, is that it will pass. But just allowing it to pass at the first few sessions is really hard. So giving education about, breathing techniques, ways to just calm that body sensation down is really, really important. And once they can start to see they're getting a little bit of control, then we can teach to let the urge subside. But I think it's really important we do it slowly. We can't run in and try and do it all at once. We have to engage the gambler, let them feel comfortable and congratulate them for seeking help, because that's the first thing that takes a lot of courage. And once they've more settled and they've got support, money's safe, then we can start to do the next steps. And then don't forget, at the end, we have to deal with the regret about money lost. what I'm finding is that lottery is a really difficult for people that have completed treatment, is because it offers a house, or wow, I could perhaps win that house back that I've lost. And so I'm finding that the relapse prevention is talking about these hooks again. They call them fishing hooks. Wow, the regret is I've lost that family holiday. There's a family holiday on Lotto, and before you know it, people are buying lottery tickets, home lottery tickets, to try and deal with that despair of the regret about a life. And so it's complicated, but it's not, because if we do it one step at a time, it works really well. But we can't just, oh my gosh, we've got to do all this. We just have to do it slowly and tick each box as we get the person closer and closer to getting better.
Yeah. There's a question that's kind of related to that, actually. That's like, does the mode of gambling matter much? And I guess they mean it in the context of addiction and harm.
It's all about accessibility to money, really, isn't it? It's about online money's really accessible. It's accessible. It's much more difficult when I'm treating somebody that's got a pokie machine problem. It's easier to treat them because they're not in the venue, and you can gradually help them get the confidence to go back into that area without the urges. But unfortunately, for example, I'm sure you're all aware, I might have a young guy who's 20, he's a tradie, and he wants to stop gambling online. And he's trying really hard, and then he gets an email to say, from Ladbrokes, to say, hey, guess what? I've noticed you haven't been gambling for a while. Here's $1,000 and your very special gambling expert to get you back on track again. And so it's actually warning them about these hooks that are trying to get them back into gambling. So they've got strategies to deal with those. So it's very difficult out there for people to stop gambling.
Yeah, I had a friend like that, and he, I guess, was met the criteria for problem gambling and gamble for a period. And then they'd contact him and he'd said, look, I'm trying to save for a house. And it didn't stop them, they just kept coming back. So there's one last one here. So thanks, Jane. This is such great information from a community education perspective. How can I reinforce the messaging to other professionals who may not be working directly in a therapeutic environment, but are still coming across gambling-related, sorry, I got an email that put in my question, but still coming across gambling-related harms in their clients, and how they might have these conversations?
Thank you so much. And all I can say is that Tony Clarkson and I did do some webinars that we've been doing and talking to communities and allied health about how to engage with people about the harms, about the hopes. So perhaps if you wanted to contact Tony in Victoria, he would contact me, and perhaps we could do a couple more webinars with you. I'm not sure, but we've developed them. So you'll have to talk to Tony about that, if that's okay. Contact me. I'm happy to help in any way.
Great, thanks, Jane. Just one more question. Would a lived experience recovered volunteers to do the education of harm be more helpful?
Oh, absolutely. People with lived experience are so helpful and so inspiring, to have the courage to go out there and talk about their experiences, and absolutely, and supporting those people that are lived experience out there with the right messages and making sure they're okay. It's a great idea.
Yep. Okay. So it's 1:27 now, and there are no further questions. So I might wrap it up. Just wanted to say thanks again so much, Jane, for your presentation. It was really awesome, and it might be almost a record, I think, for questions and comments. So obviously people enjoyed it a lot. So that's about it for now. Just to quickly mention, we'll have another webinar late next month with Associate Professor Alex Russell, 28th of June, that'll be, and we'll send out a reminder about that. But yeah, that aside, thanks again to Jane, and thanks to everyone for all your questions.
And could I just say thank you for all your lovely comments? I'm seeing them pop up. So thank you, everybody. It was such a pleasure to share my work with you all and for your interest.